So Mark has told you a bit about the cognitive interview and the costs and benefits of using this technique. Now, what does a cognitive interview actually involve? Well, we were lucky to be able to record a presentation by Dr. Nina Westera about interviewing adults who go to police after they've been sexually assaulted. As part of this presentation, Dr. Westera talked about what is involved in conducting a cognitive interview, as well as the psychological principles that the cognitive interview is based on. Now, I should tell you that she's ideally placed to talk about this topic. Dr. Westera actually became an academic researcher after a career as a detective in the New Zealand police force. She used to train the police who would interview victims, and the core part of that training was teaching people how to use the cognitive interview with witnesses.
Another thing that really matters is how witnesses are interviewed. And cognitive psychologists have done a lot of work on this as well. So not just the questions that are asked, but but the other dynamics that go on in an interview. So Fisher and Geiselman are big founding leaders, I suppose, in how adult witnesses are interviewed. They first did studies in the sort of 1980s looking at what they call the cognitive interview. And what Fisher and Geiselman are, they're cognitive psychologists who were one day approached by a couple of members from a burglary squad in police members from a burglary squad in Florida, and these police members said, we feel like we can get more out of our eyewitnesses to these robberies, but we just don't know how. You guys, cognitive psychologists, can you spend a bit of time away from playing with your pigeons and come and help us, and apply what you know about science and about how memory works to try and get more information and more detail. Oh, yeah, sorry. yeah, you're probably right. It's more stereotypes, they're so problematic. And that's exactly what they did, and they founded what's called the cognitive interview. And basically what they did is they took what they knew about how memory works and they used that to try and enhance the amount of information recalled. And they did this successfully. Studies have since shown that with the cognitive interview, it on average gets 40% more detail than a standard interview, right? Without compromising on accuracy. Right? So the average accuracy rate is lower. I mean, it means there's still more errors because there's more information, but the average accuracy rate is lower. And what they did things is, but what they found very quickly, and I'll talk about the mnemonics or the memory aids that they used in a little moment, but what they also found is that police were just actually really hopeless at interviewing. They just had really poor communication skills, so they layered those communication skills in. So those are things like building rapport, which is, just everyone agrees that that's fundamental. And these are standards in all interviewing protocol, not just cognitive interview. Having a clear description of the rules to the interview process, use of open questions as the primary method of eliciting information, and a willingness to explore alternative hypotheses, so having that open mind. And these are foundations not just to what Fisher and Geiselman did, these are foundations to child interviewing protocol and to all other interviewing protocol. Even with suspects, the foundation is exactly the same. So they layered that in there. And with the cognitive interview, basically they used a mixture of mnemonics. So mnemonics are just memory aiding tools essentially that officers could use. And I won't go into each one of them in a huge amount of detail, but basically these mnemonics sort of monopolised on what they knew about memory recall. So context reinstatement is the idea that you get the victim or the witness to think back to where they were at the time of what happened, what was going on around them, what they felt and what they felt and what they saw and they heard. So to recreate the psychological and physical context of that time. And that helps with retrieving memory. So the more similar your environment of recall to the environment where the event originally happened, the better the recall. And which is something we all experience day to day. Like, for example, if you go back to your old school or your old university, suddenly you have all these memories flooding back that you never had before. And that's because you're back in the context where those memories were originally encoded. So they used that and applied it and said, okay, well, it might be tricky for officers to take your complainants or your victims back to the scene of the crime, but instead what we'll do is we'll give you a series of instructions. You can give the complainant a series of instructions to help them think back and recreate that context. And it is fairly effective at increasing the amount of information recalled. So asking the witness to think back to where they were, what was going on, what was felt, and so forth. And that's just an example of one of the mnemonics, but there are other ones that took advantage of witness memory that they used as well. And so 40% more detail. So these are things that can be, obviously, these are all evidence-based methods that can be used. So one of the things I'm working on at the moment is the problem with this protocol in an adult sexual assault scenario. So I think the cognitive interview and obviously the research has given us a really good starting point in terms of how to get the highest quality information from complainants. But I think adult sexual assault complaints cases are different. If you think about how the cognitive interview was designed, it was designed for a typical eyewitness scenario where there's a witness, right, who experiences a sort of emotionally neutral event. You know, they're a witness to a robbery, they're not actually, you know, they watch it from the side, they don't have the firearm pointed at them, they don't have a previous relationship with the offender. And typically these studies, of course, are tested on students as well, all right, who often have a good cognitive ability and aren't under stress so much when they're being interviewed. Anyway, and the whole sole purpose and the sole outcomes is not only the circumstances a little bit superficial when you try and generalise them to a adult sexual assault scenario, but the other thing is the whole purpose of the cognitive interview is to increase the amount of detail. And part of the problem with that is that we're getting more and more evidence to suggest that in some circumstances detail may actually be problematic. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that when we talk about cross-examination further down the track. And part of the difficulty with that is it makes sense for an investigative perspective to get more detail in an eyewitness robbery scenario because you don't know the identity of the offender. So without the identity of the offender, you have nothing. You need to identify who that person is. So you need to use every tool in the belt, every cognitive mnemonic to try and work out, get as much detail as you can about that person so you can identify who they are. We know that in most sexual assault cases, that is not the problem. The problem isn't offender identification. The problem is, was consent given? Right. And the problem with encouraging someone to record a large amount of detail is that it can be tiring. Right. So we've got a traumatised witness, who's experienced not just a 5-minute video clip, but has experienced something perhaps overnight or over days or over weeks or over years, who may be vulnerable for other reasons, trying to maintain a high level of concentration to repeatedly go over events to recall detail. And I think there are some issues about that, and I think we can do better with that, which is something that I'm looking at the moment in terms of how we can improve that. We also know from those repeated recalls that may, well, we need to look at this more as well, but that may well reduce the coherence of the account by a witness repeatedly going over things, which is what the cognitive interview does. It encourages multiple retrieval attempts. So I think we need to learn more about that and the effectiveness of that account. The lack of coherence is a problem, maybe a problem further down the track as far as confusion of the witnesses going in terms of the different accounts that they give, but it also might be a problem for police in terms of them processing the information that the complainant gives and trying to work out what's relevant and what's not. So we need to do more work, and I'm doing some work at the moment with Martine Powell particularly, and I've done some work with Mark Keble and Becky Milne as well. I'm trying to work out what detail is relevant. So talking to investigators and prosecutors and asking them, well, what do you think is really important in terms of establishing consent, or what's investigatively important? And then to try and look at ways that we can perhaps elicit that information in a less onerous way on the complainant. It's really hard to test this stuff in the lab, so it's one of those things that we think we're going to have to... I think there's really strong research and theory around how we can do this better, so it's one of those things we're probably going to have to just go out there and field test, because you just can't simulate those conditions, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure. Anyway, and also the other things that we don't know is we don't know all the research on interviewing processes looks at how to improve recall. It doesn't deal with the other dynamics that are going on in the interview. So I've talked a little bit about the investigative and evidential dynamics and the goals around that, but it doesn't also look at the issues around behaviours. So for the clinicians here, you'll probably all be aware that when you're interviewing someone who's traumatised, you know, there's behaviours and emotions that are really difficult to manage that come with that. And we don't really know, I suppose from some of the research we can sort of anticipate what they might be, but we don't really know enough about what they are. We're doing some work at the moment asking police officers what they think are the challenges when they're dealing with these complainants. But there's things that are there, like getting a high level of detail about the actual sexual acts, about dealing with the complainant trying to manage their credibility, so only giving part of the account. In other words, not wanting to disclose that they kissed the offender earlier in the night because they are worried about the implications of that. And just plain distress, just breaking down and crying and not wanting to talk about it, when of course the officer needs that information. So these are sort of areas of research that I think we need to do more on, and I'm trying to actively work on, and if there's other people that want to work on that too, that's great, because we need to find out more. I think we really need to tailor what we're doing to these special type of cases. But regardless of that, and regardless of where we need to go, I think we've got a really good foundation. We know about the really important use of open questions and how that can make such a big difference to the quality of the information that's produced. We know about different mnemonics we can use if more information is required and more detail is required. And these are fundamental. So it's fundamental for police and for other people interviewing to be aware of these issues and to use the science behind that to base how they question and how they interview these types of complainants. Yeah, and that's not necessarily being done. How we interview adults is often just totally disregarded. With children, it's looked at, it's scrutinised, but with adults, it's just like, just go out and interview them. Come back with an end result. Let's not go into detail about how you actually do that.